Hey guys, what's going on? John here from What's Spinning here tonight to chat about this new M83 album, DSVII. M83 is the French dream pop shoegaze project of Anthony Gonzalez, who in the early years kind of underwhelmed me around the time of their self-titled debut. I thought Anthony had a pretty cool sound. I liked his dystopian vibes and the heavy synths, but I felt like he was still shaping his sound, and he eventually did just that. Like around the time of Dead Cities, Red Seas, and Lost Ghosts, hell yes, I was into this album. Most of the music here was still instrumental, but there was everything here from post-rock to electronic, and Anthony had some really cool ideas. Now, around the time of their Digital Shades Volume 1, I feel like people fell off a little bit with M83, and I could see why. I actually felt like Anthony and company could have used a little bit of a refresher around that time, which they absolutely did around the time of Saturdays Equals Youth. This is a wonderful synth pop and dream pop album with Anthony bringing in more vocals than ever. From big singles like We Own the Sky and Kim and Jesse to deep cuts like my personal favorite M83 track, Skin of the Night, this album is just great. But then after that, I kind of fell off with M83 again. I thought Hurry Up We're Dreaming had great moments, but it didn't need to be a double album. And Junk, that came out a couple of years after, is a very special album, and it's honestly like the best title for that album because it's absolute trash. Now, this newest album has shown Anthony returning to the Digital Shades series that he started years ago with DSVII. Let's chat about this thing. I mean, honestly, it's M83. You know what you're getting into at this point, except this time as an album, we're dealing with less vocals, to be honest. And you know what? There's actually a handful of genuinely tasteful instrumental synth pop and dream pop tracks here. Take, for example, A Bit of Sweetness. This is actually pretty cool, and I love a lot of the production and the sound play here. Everything just seems to be fluid, working its way in and out. It's haunting and genuinely has some beautiful moments as well. And the vocal samples, while simple, actually add a lot to this. And let me tell you, the very whimsical vibe here brings me back to the early days of M83. Now, newsflash, while a lot of this album is cheap nostalgia, while it's done right, honestly, M83 nail it. I have a lot of the same feelings on Colonies. I love the build-up at the beginning of this one, the way that M83 really take their time. Some of the tones here are just so warm, so likable. Like, honestly, it's one of the more straightforward tracks here, but these icy synth drones and this great atmosphere are really enjoyable. On paper, this track should actually be pretty boring. Not a lot happens, but Anthony shows at least that he's interested here, and this track has a whole lot of heart. The serene beauty of this track is actually pretty overwhelming. And while this might just seem cheap to say, it's just a really nice sounding track. Feelings, on the other hand, perfectly encapsulates this retro, 8-bit, very early video game soundtrack vibe that Anthony's been going for this entire album. Not to mention, there's a serious sense of mystery here, which is great. Now, you're not going to hear me say this a lot here, but this track is genuinely pretty perfect. It's charming, it's the perfect amount of nostalgic, and it makes me want to hear more of this. And not to mention, it progresses masterfully. This is honestly the sound I should have heard on this entire album. Luna de Feel, once again, very cool. I love how cosmic and dark this one is. Hell, it's even a little intense. The synth work here is actually pretty awesome, and when this track picks up, it becomes one of the busiest tracks here. Now, while I still think that Anthony overall missed the mark of this album with his themes of early video game soundtracks, it's moments like this that actually make me feel like this could have been something special. And when this track explodes, it becomes actually pretty grandiose. It's tracks like this that make me think that this album actually kind of does belong in the M83 catalog, even though so much of this album disputes that. And I do really love A Taste of the Dusk. This track is so simple, so effective. To me, this kind of nails it with that sense of nostalgia, that early video game soundtrack that, once again, Anthony's been going for this entire album. Honestly, this track hits so hard. To be honest, if you told me this was like an early video game soundtrack, I probably would believe you. It's whimsical. It just lets me escape for a few minutes, which is really what this whole album should be doing. And the backing vocals are a very nice touch. But whoa, Nelly, a lot of this album is just, not very good at all. As a matter of fact, more than anything, it's just kind of a bunch of cheap nostalgia. Take, for example, this album's intro, Hell Riders. It's a very subtle, drawn-out intro. And I do have to emphasize that we don't get anything for almost 2 minutes. I mean, look, there is a serenity here that I do have to admire. Like, the plucking is great. The very icy atmosphere is really nice, too. But I'll be honest, most of this track just comes off heartless. doesn't really move me. This kind of just comes off like a cheap imitation. I do kind of appreciate some of the group vocals that pop in. Those are actually pretty haunting. But the rest of this near 7 minutes is just soulless. One thing I do have to say is a lot of the production here is top notch. Anthony knows what he's doing by now. But Goodbye Captain Lee, on the other hand, is much more complex of a track. There's a whole lot more studio trickery here. But once again, this is just so unbelievably soulless. It's just so gimmicky. There are some charming ideas sprinkled in, but Anthony just can do so much better. Meet the Friends is very whimsical, it's light on the ears, and sure, from a distance, it's very pleasant. But these instrumentals are just so flat, I feel like anybody could have thrown this together. Sadly, this track isn't even beautiful. The beauty of this album has come and gone already. This track just kind of floats in, floats out, and doesn't stop me in my tracks. By the time I get to a word of wisdom, I'm like begging this album to stop. This is borderline goofy for me, and genuinely, actually pretty laughable. Flimsy instrumental brings in no emotion whatsoever, and the vocals end up taking away from this track. Yes, that's possible. Then we have Joe DeFonce, and you know what? I have to give Anthony some credit. Honestly, the pianos here are really emotional and genuinely beautiful. But for me, I feel like this track is incomplete. It starts nice, but goes nowhere. Like, this could have been a nice, sweet little interlude with some really beautiful licks, but I feel like Anthony missed the mark. And I do like a lot of the texturing on Lunar Sun, to be honest. Like, some of the synths are very pleasant here and all. But once again, everything else about this track that makes its way in just kind of stinks up the joint. From a distance, this may just sound like everything is, like, right where it should be. But nothing about this track speaks to me at all. You know, this album overall is really disappointing because we do have late album moments like Mirage, which are actually more disappointing than anything just because of how unbelievably good they are. When Anthony hits like a certain note or like a certain vibe, he hits so hard that I'm instantly taken back to the early days of M83. Like, listening to this track, I found myself beaming by how incredibly warm these synths come off. Like, I don't know what he did so differently here, but this is genuinely a moving track. And overall, it's just a wonderful piece of ambient music. But the rest of these tracks just show Anthony missing the mark completely. This could have been special. But then we get tracks like Oh Yes, You're There Every Day. Here, we have these synths, and it's honestly all I could freaking cling to, even though it's the most inhuman element here. But everything else about this track is just bugging me, this quaint, wishy-washy sound. There's no body to this track whatsoever. It just kind of sounds pathetic. I don't even feel like Anthony's trying to make a video game soundtrack anymore. He actually kind of sounds like he's making backing music for like a 90s sitcom. Typhon Glory is just so unbelievably up in the air. The production here is fine. The atmosphere is great. But this instrumental immediately falls apart. And sure, Anthony's trying to piece together one of the more hopeful sounding tracks here. That's great. But once again, it's just so cheap. And going into this album, I didn't like Temple of Sorrow, and I still don't, to be honest. Like, yes, at the intro, with all this build-up, yeah, it's a little exciting. I was expecting something big, but no. Straight up, this track is genuinely boring. There are a few nice moments scattered between its 7-minute runtime, torturous, but overall, it's exhausting. Send help, please. Oh boy, this album is rough. A lot of Anthony's ideas are pretty flimsy. Without vocals, I find like they have almost nothing to cling to. And not to mention, most of this album is completely void of any soul or emotion. When Anthony gets it right, honestly, he proves that he can actually pull this sound together in a moment that's just so special. And there are a handful of tracks like that here. But overall, this album is exhausting emotionally and just void of any emotion. I'm feeling like a strong 5 on it. But let me know what you guys think down below. If you liked the video, be sure to give us a like, give us a subscribe, and let me know down below what you would like for me to chat about in the future. And until next time, have a great day, guys.